I believe I'm still on mute, Randy. And we're on. Yes, good morning and welcome to Western Standard Time. I'm, of course, or rather, Western Standard Time. That's, of course, the Western Standard mixed with my show's name at the same moment. Let's try that again, shall we? All right, miscue. Hello and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede. And, of course, today I'll be joined by John C. Thompson, a founding member of Civitas, a member formerly of the Mackenzie Institute when it came to strategic global initiatives and strategic thinking around the world. He's going to explain to us a little bit more what's going on in Israel and Gaza and everything else that's happening in the Middle East. He's going to give us some perspective on that. He's going to be on at 9:30 Pacific, 10:30 Mountain. Remember to like and subscribe. Subscribe to the Western Standard on the website and support us. We don't get a big check from the Liberals every year to indoctrinate you with nonsense and fake news like CBC does. And of course, subscribe to us on YouTube and on Facebook. Help our numbers go up, and you will be notified when we go live. To my opening statement. Conflict in the Middle East is nothing new, but after the period of relative stability during Trump's presidency, which saw landmark peace agreements signed and former enemies become allies in order to counter an ever more aggressive Iranian regime, the region has again descended into chaos, and this time at unprecedented speed. We will leave rehashing the questions about the state of Israel, past territorial claims, and what is now happening in the region to our guest, who is an expert on such matters. For myself, the two most important points are the following. First, Israel has a right to exist. The second, those living within the West Bank and Gaza are being used as political cannon fodder by some very evil people. Israel's detractors have often declared that it is an illegitimate state. Of course, unlike most nations today, Israel only exists because of an act of law, as well as recognition by the international community at its inception. No state is perfect. No government is without fault. But Israel is the only country that started as a democracy approved by other democracies. Israel remains a democracy today with liberal values around free speech, economic rights, and private association. It is legal, for example, to be a homosexual in Israel. Try doing that in Palestine. That's not going to work out for you. It's not going to work out for you in all the surrounding nations. But if you are in Israel, you probably will live and cherish and move on in life. The fact of the matter is that I once heard there were LGBTQ lobbyists that were pro-Palestine, anti-Israel. There was a sign out there, something that said literally "gays for Palestine," and that makes about as much sense as a pacifist in favor of an arms race. So, what we need to understand is that even while being in near constant threat of invasion all the time, war and indiscriminate rocket attacks, Israel remains a democracy with mandatory conscription and the rigorous debate of ideas. All the while, those who live in the Gaza Strip or West Bank, let alone the nations that surround the state of Israel on every side, cannot allow their citizens to vote lest they oust their overlords. The proof is in the pudding. Residents of all non-Israeli parts of the Levant exist at the pleasure of the strongmen and terrorist groups that run them. The Palestinian Authority doesn't tolerate any dissent. Issues aren't brought up for debate or plebiscite, that is to say voting, right? The press doesn't get to criticize those in charge. The people who the PA rules are essentially treated as slaves and human shields. And we need to understand that. It is slavery. It's entirely slavery, and it's wrong. There is a place for legitimate criticism of Israel and the leadership. Of course, the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, or as he's affectionately called, Bibi by many, is literally fighting to keep his role just so he will not be indicted for various counts of, cronyism. But an honest assessment of Israeli policy still reveals that life for even the most maligned person in Israel is far better than on the other side of that checkpoint. And Israel doesn't call for the destruction of Arabs or Palestinians or any particular racial group or ethnic group or religion. Israel simply wants to exist. Perhaps Israel and her neighbors are doomed to perpetual conflict, but the scriptures do say otherwise in that old prophecy, for someday they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and they shall make war no more. I've grown up, of course, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict my entire life. I mean, we all have since basically the inception of Israel. But the issue, of course, deep down inside of it all is that, of course, you've got two religions that are opposed. You have people groups that, technically speaking, are of the same ethnicity. If you're a Semite, you are that's an entire part of that area. It's a subgroup of the Arab ethnicity. So that's a thing. Ironically, being anti-Semitic doesn't necessarily, it's come to mean anti-Jewish, but technically speaking, the Semite ethnicity is not just Jewish people. And indeed, there are lots of Jews at this point who are not Semites, right? Strictly biologically speaking, in their heritage. But the point is that what kind of hits me between the eyes with all of it is that when it comes to Israel and Palestine, there just never seems to be a solution. There never seems to be a way of kind of dissolving this conflict and finally getting to the end. But I think a lot of that has to do with vested interests. I think whether you're talking about arms dealers or clearly selling weapons, probably to both sides, but certainly to the Palestinians, whether you're talking about the role of Iran and the various other agitation that happens from the rest of the Muslim world channeled through Hamas and through the other terrorist organizations that are around Israel and trying to infiltrate Israel. And finally, if you look at even kind of the agitation that happens within Israel itself, it's not that it shouldn't have self-criticism, but it does have elements within its own society that, yes, they're allowed to have their criticism, but throughout the wider Western world, there's a deep resentment of Israel. To what end? I don't know why. I don't know why anybody thinks that Israel deserves any more resentment than any other country does. There's plenty of other countries that have done worse things. And Israel is just the newest country on the block. It's the newest kid on the block. And it's had some struggles and it's made some bad decisions in the past every now and again. But ultimately, it fights a fundamentally defensive tactic when it comes to these attacks. So I don't really understand why that's the case. But we actually have John on the line right now. He's a little bit earlier than I expected him, but that's fine. We're going to bring him on right away, and we're going to talk about what's going on with Israel and Palestine. John, welcome to the program. It's good to have you back. Of course, you were literally employed to think about geostrategic initiatives and what that had to do with things. What is happening right now? Why is it happening? And can you walk us through a little bit of why the Middle East is always so unstable? Why can't we all just get along?
Well, you're asking a question that people have been asking for 3,000 years. And anything that colors with the Middle East is got all sorts of dimensions to it. Nothing is simple. Just as a sidebar issue, for example, the civil war in Syria. A lot of people think it's a regular rebellion against the Assad family. There are at least 3 dimensions of the civil war in Syria that most people don't consider. Part of it is the Sunni Shia split that's been going on almost since Muhammad died, 14 centuries ago. It's also the split between sort of the modernists who think that the Middle East should develop in a new direction, and the Salafists who literally are clinging to that old time religion, who want to think that the way forward is by going backwards, the way Islam used to be. And of course, you also have the other dimension, which has been going on for 500 years, is the fight between the Persians and the Turks over who gets to rule the Arabs. And those are 3 dimensions you have to consider in one war. So, I mean, if you look at things in Israel and the Palestinians, again, they're just a whole series of shades and a whole series of dimensions. But some things are very simple. For example, the Israelis want to be left alone. Actually, most Palestinians do, but the Israelis have a democratic society, contentious, many debates. They still haven't got a written constitution, but the Knesset is one of the liveliest places for democratic discussion on earth. And of course, the Palestinians who have, it's not generally known unless you spend time on the West Bank, as I have, and talk to Palestinians, and that's this yearning for new leadership. The problem is that Palestinian society is based on an absolute rejection and hatred of Israel. So the Israelis are free with their opinions. I mean, and, if you got 3 Israelis, you got 4 opinions, all of which are, defended quite strenuously. Palestinians normally have 2. one public, which they share, and one private, which they share very, very rarely. And the younger kids don't even have that second opinion yet. It's the older Palestinians who believe that, or wish that they could actually live more stable lives without their current leadership. And it's one of the most interesting discoveries I've ever made, and most reporters miss it.
With what happens in the Middle East, I mean, you couldn't blame some people. I mean, we should always be paying attention to things, but some people have grown very tired of the various conflicts and the perpetual war. People just don't really understand it. They can't have a grasp of it. If someone comes to you and honestly says, "Try and help me understand, even in just concrete terms, what's happening in this latest conflict. What sparked this?" If they couldn't understand everything else, they couldn't understand the '67 war and everything else that's happened between Israel and its neighbors. In this precise instance, there seemed to be a relative peace for a time. Now all of a sudden there's rockets flying again. What has happened? What has failed?
Well, the simplest thing was Ramadan. And the simple thing also was that the Palestinians, or the Palestinian leadership, and remember they've got two sets of leadership, have been sidelined. They were losing. And so this was, first of all, an attempt with a minor issue about some people defaulting on their rent in East Jerusalem that are built around Ramadan to let the Palestinian Authority, Abbas and company, get back in the spotlight again so they could resume their street credibility and hopefully get the checks flowing again. Because let's face it, Palestinians are poor, not their leaders. They live very, very well. They've got very sticky fingers. But the second thing, of course, is you've got Hamas that's in rivalry with the Palestinians. So the Palestinian Authority provoked the street punch-ups in Jerusalem and everything around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then the Hamas derailed the Palestinian Authority by bombarding Israel. And so you've got two Arab factions, both of which have been sidelined and don't like it, playing off against each other about how much they hate Israel.
And hatred of Israel, it's funny how far spread that is. There were protests. Apparently you can only get COVID at church in Canada or in the Western world. So you not at Costco, not at Walmart, and apparently not at pro-Palestinian protests. Nothing wrong with trying to say, hey, think of the children. I don't want anyone innocent killed in any conflict ever. I certainly don't. I was raised by Mennonites. I don't think that the death of innocents is fair. But at the same time, the idea that somehow that as if Israel had invited this attack or as Israel was the aggressor, how do things get so twisted here in the West? How is Israel always cast as kind of this villain in Western media?
Well, to get to there, you have to sort of go back to the beginning of the Palestinian movement, which actually began before there was in Israel back in the 1920s. But if you then look at, say, when Israel became independent in 1948, a lot of Arabs were persuaded to flee their homes by other Arabs. There was also, of course, some sort of ethnic cleansing by the Israelis, but the main part was that Arabs were told, get out, the Jews are coming, flee. And the ones that stayed behind have become Israeli citizens, fully functional members of society, and quite prosperous. The ones that left were then turned into a demographic weapon by the Arab states of the time to constantly be a pressure on Israel. So in the Palestinian community in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, from the start, your credibility, your potential for leadership rests with an eternal hatred. So if you actually grow tired of it, and a lot of Palestinians have, to publicly express that, well, since the 1940s, actually since the 1930s, Palestinian Arabs who thought they could get along with the Jews have been murdered by the extremists. And, to this day, again, what you say publicly and what you say privately are very different, because if you have, If you express your private opinions publicly, you remember like 1984 and Hate Week in the original novel?
Yep.
Hate Week happens quite often among the Palestinians. And if you've been known to be moderate, to think, maybe we could do better and we could get rid of this, lot of sticky-fingered scoundrels that we've got leading us and find a new future. You're the one who could end up hung from a lamppost. And that's that's again one important reason why a lot of Palestinians keep their regrets in other opinions to themselves, just because they don't want to be singled out.
When it comes to Israel itself, a very prosperous nation, obviously still doing development, still incredible intellectual property rights as well as technology. It's a very prosperous place, and it's incredible to have this tiny little country, right, surrounded by all these much larger countries that are far better endowed and have oil and all sorts of things going for them. And yet it really does show you the difference in leadership. What do you think makes Israeli leadership distinctive? Or is it their citizens too? Is the universal enlistment and conscription, is that what kind of makes Israel different than its neighbors?
Well, no. I mean, you've got widespread conscription in a number of other countries. And actually, it's kind of weird, but if you've been in the streets of Egypt or Jordan, gun shops are a lot more common than you might know. They've got a fairly wide firearms ownership, but these are well-armed societies. It's actually also strange. Muslim societies are also, for the most part, with some obvious exceptions, very quiet. They don't go into crime against each other as much as happens in other parts of the world. But that's also an aside. But the main thing is the Israelis are different in a number of ways, and most people. I think that's one reason why anti-Semitism always flares up. Because if you look at the Jewish religion, and remember, I'm Catholic, so I'm not Jewish. I'm speaking as an outsider here. But it is a society. I mean, the Jews have a holiday given over for debate. You go to the synagogue and you're debating moral and ethical issues all night. It's just one of their holidays. The other thing is that 2,000 years of diaspora has taught the Jews one thing. The local prince, Muslim or Christian, can deprive you of all your gold, all your treasure, everything, all your property, rob you of everything, but he can't get after the stuff that's in your head. So, there's been a long stress on education. And again, if you look at the Jewish religion, when you're, especially if you're a teenage boy, I mean, your intellectual abilities are tested and examined and honed. It's a way that, for example, in the Catholic Church, the Jesuits copied the Jewish model. And again, we've looked at the Jesuits have turned out, all sorts of intellectuals and scientists for centuries. Well, I mean, Jews are very represented because you've got this very, very long tradition of harvesting people's intellect and honing it and working on it. And that's why, among other things, why the Israel is just got such an outsized reputation, especially, in physics, in medicine, and chemistry. The world is on the edge of some very interesting changes, and a lot of those changes are being led out of schools in Israel. Your grandchildren might live to be healthy, able, and active well into their second century. That's going to come from Israeli schools. That's projects they're working on already for everybody. It's one of the things that goes on there. So it's this society that's got this outsized ability to produce people of genuine talent. The other thing, though, is that, if you look at Israeli politics, they debate all the time. It's an interesting thesis. I mean, you'd probably know who Victor Davis Hanson is. But have you ever read his book, Carnage and Culture?
I haven't.
Well, he was asking the question about 20 years ago, why is it throughout history. The Western world is always, ever since, the ancient Greeks kicked the crap out of everybody else. And part of his thesis was that, we're always arguing, debating. So we're producing new ideas. You can go into a number of examples quite quickly, but say, for example, one of the most brilliant military naval victories in history was Salamis, when the Persians were nearly destroyed Athens. And the Greeks had won this incredible naval victory, but it wasn't without a furious debate among themselves first. And the Greek leader actually sent a message to the Persian emperor and the Shah, and basically said, we're about to escape. You better block us. And that lured the Persian Navy into an ambush in which they were massacred. So debate and dissension and new ideas, it's a strength, actually. It sounds like it's weak, but consensus, universal consensus, is a lame way to go for any society. All right, sit in the Knesset building and listen. They debate. They are arguing all the time. And that actually means that they produce a number of really incredible ideas. For example, the Israeli Mossad is legendary for its influence. It's a small organization. It's not that large and not that well trained, but they think. And, they are not orthodox by any means. I mean, orthodox in terms of their approaches to intelligence. And they've achieved results after impressive results time after time. Well, it's like that across the board for just about every institution in Israel.
Let's speak a little bit more about the Knesset, and of course the fact that we have a certain prime minister who's in charge right now. It's Benjamin Netanyahu. Yeah, he's been around for a little while. He has won incredible victories by the skin of his teeth over and over again, combining with the Likud party and with the ultra-Orthodox, and using his... If there was anybody who was ever a wheeler and dealer, it's Bibi. He's done an incredible job, while also fighting some conflicts in that time as well, between Israel and their neighbors. Is he the focal point, or is the Knesset backing him up? Which way will the Knesset vote on this next question? Are they going to continue to back him up, or he's going to win election again if this conflict continues? What's happening?
I wish I knew, because again, Israeli politics are very strange. In fact, actually, some of the real experts on Knesset politics are Palestinians. Not just the Palestinian leadership, but ordinary Palestinians. I mean, I remember one of the many conversations I had with a taxi driver in the West Bank. He said they're still waiting for the Israelis, for the Jews to decide who they are. And again, they understand Knesset politics very, very well. I mean, it's almost second nature to them. And there's a constant stew. And yes, it does mean that minor groups have actually had an outsized influence because, even before Bibi, other Israeli leaders had to hold a coalition together. And remember, Israel still doesn't have a written constitution. They've never been able to agree on one. It's what's gone on is it's very British-like in some ways, consensus and precedent and custom.
Which, of course, has served England very well. I mean, technically speaking, the Magna Carta could be discarded tomorrow. Any part of their constitution could be rewritten or written out or set aside. That hasn't necessarily worked out very well in Canada or the United States, having a locked, dead, stuck constitution. Trying to get people to agree on amendments and everything else. Canada's never accomplished it. I don't think America has accomplished it since Nixon got rid of the draft.
Yeah, but the Israelis just keep going forward, coming up to crisis after crisis after crisis, and that includes the domestic politics, and still moving forward. And it does mean, though, that everybody in the country pays close attention and has an opinion. But as I said, that's not just the Jews, that's the Arabs as well.
Let's walk back a little bit to your own experience of your time there. You've spent time in the Middle East. You've spent time in Israel and in the surrounding area. What's your personal impression of what's happening on the ground in the Middle East? What are you picking up there that we can't really get through TV or through the media?
Well, one thing, and this is something that's really alarmed the Palestinian Authority leadership, is that I guess, again, this is very complex, all sorts of levels to it. And again, some brilliant intellectuals have looked at it and described it, which means, they produce books that have been very, very illuminating, and nobody in the Western world has read them. But one of the issues that's gone on inside the Arab world since the First World War has been about what way forward. And, where do we go from here? The Bernard Lewis, in his book, What Went Wrong, said, you have two questions when things have collapsed. And, who did this to us? Or alternatively, why did this happen? And, who did this is one way, is comfortable question to ask, because then you can blame someone. Mm-hmm. Why did this happen is actually focusing on one's own internal problems. So, if you look since the 1930s and 40s, you've had sort of two driving forces in the Arab world, one of which are the Salafists, and that is a radical sect of the Sunni Islam, which basically says that the way we go forward is by going back and looking 14 centuries ago, bring back that old-time religion. And remember, the Salafists are behind Al-Qaeda, they're behind ISIS. They also helped create both the Palestinian Authority and then lost control of it. But also they're behind Hamas. The second side were the ones who sort of looked outside and said, okay, we've got to find a new solution. But a lot of them tended to look at the communists or the Nazis. So, you've had since the Second World War this sort of tension inside the Arab world, where on one side you have nationalist, militarist dictators, such as, who led Iraq, who led Syria, who led Egypt for many years. And then they've been focused on the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a Salafist organization. So, they've been fighting each other constantly over the future. Well, around 2002, a number of Arab intellectuals, very, very, again, the Arab world can produce some very, very brave intellectuals, and they have. But they looked and they said, we got to stop this. Every time we start making social progress in the Arab world, somebody, either, a general, or a militarist, or the Salafists, points at Israel and goes, what about them? And refocuses the desperate need for modernization on the Arab world in the Israeli-Palestinian parameter. And that has worked for 50 years to derail any social development in the Middle East. Well, if you look very carefully in the last few years, last couple of decades, what you've got, especially with the Gulf Arabs, Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states, is a realization that the oil prosperity is going to run out. They've got to transition themselves. And again, there's been very, very slow, constant development. And one of the things that happened, and Trump took some credit for it because he had a hand in doing it, but he also remembered that the Arabs had to themselves recognize it's time to have a new approach to Israel. So for the last 5 years or so, you've got the growing relationship with Arab states with Israel, because they want trade with Israel. They want advantage, with all this new technology. And they have other problems to focus on. Because remember, the Turks, and the president of Turkey is a Salafist, in case, people don't know. And the Persians are still fighting it out amongst themselves, but they still both believe that they should rule the Arab world, not Arabs. So the Saudis, have been starting to reform. The Gulf Arabs have been starting to reform. But one of the ways they're reforming is they regard the Palestinian Authority as dead weight, as an anchor to the past. So they've been stopping payment for it. And that's cutting into the personal income of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. And they hate the fact that the large sections of the Arab world are normalizing relations with Israel. That's another reason why this has erupted. It's a way of actually seeing if they can put a stick in that particular set of spokes and stop Israel's normalization of relations with a number of Arab states.
One of the things that we were all hoping might be for the better, and it happened in my lifetime, I remember writing about it at my old gig, was of course the Arab Spring. So we had hopes that the Arab Spring would mature into democratic Arab countries, that the Middle East would finally become full of liberal democracies, not by invasion or imposition or kind of neoconservative ideas, but rather by their own people rising up and saying, you know what, we're getting a bad deal. This is a bad deal. We're we have cell phones, we have technology, we have cars. Why can't we have a modern government and throw off the fetters of their ancient regimes and try and strongmen regimes and try and create and their post-colonial regimes and create democracies? One of the places where that spiked up probably strongest and where we thought for a brief moment that things might change was Egypt. And then, of course, Egypt fell apart and the military had to take over in order to keep it from falling apart worse. So what happened with the Arab Spring? Can you walk us through that a bit? Was there any hope in it, or was it a kind of false flag or a miscue in the West and we didn't really understand what was happening?
Well, there's one dimension with the Arab Spring that is the point that we keep forgetting all the time. And if we look back at our own history, like what really drove the French Revolution? What was the real cause? Or what was the real cause in 1848, the year of revolutions in Europe?
Mm-hmm.
Food shortages, food prices. What drove the Nazis? Cheap bread. What happened in the Arab Spring? As a result of 2008 and the fiscal future, basically every investor in the world was driving the price of food up because that seemed like a reasonable way to make a profit. Food prices climbed enormously. And when food prices go up, people start getting nervous about where their next meal's coming from. So again, food prices drove the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. Then what happened was you had all the Democrats, you had all the reformers, you had all the people who thought that the world should modernize. But if you look, from Tunisia, where it started, you look at Libya, you look at what happened in Egypt, particularly, who was the concerted opposition that was able to take most advantage? The Salafists. And, the Muslim Brotherhood, basically won the first election in Egypt. And then all of a sudden the Egyptians went, oh, we have made an incredible mistake. Get them out. So there was a lot of support for the military, which represented the other view, to try and take things over because Egyptians were more comfortable with that. The Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, were more dangerous. And remember that the Muslim Brotherhood is banned in a lot of the Arab world as it is a dangerous organization. And we know in Canada, we've got members of parliament who are members of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's one of the points where a lot of Westerners do not really understand how subversive and how dangerous this particular organization is, where Arabs do. So the Egyptians, they made a promising start, but again, it's sort of like, Germany in the 1920s. You've got all sorts of different political parties, all sorts of different opinions. But in the meantime, you've got the communists and the Nazis duking it out over who gets to rule over Germany with a whip hand. And you know which one of them won.
And it could have been different. And that's the thing that people don't seem to understand. There could have been an entirely collectivist, but and I mean, not that Nazism is actually right wing. We can debate that all day. But the point is that an entirely collectivist and tyrannical civilization in Germany, but it being colored with Marxian dogma instead of fascist dogma. And people don't seem to understand that at all. They just think it was all doomed to happen one direction, but it wasn't.
No, I mean, the communists very nearly won. Um, but again, in the Arab world, that pluralist tendency, the intellectuals keep pushing, keep working hard towards reform. And we're seeing them even in such unlikely places as Saudi Arabia. They're slowly winning. Another aspect of things that a lot of people don't quite realize, because again, it's too subtle, especially for most of the slogan shouters. But since 2005, 2006, the Saudis have warmed up a lot to the Israelis. Remember in 2006 when Hezbollah in Lebanon started firing rockets in northern Israel and faced that short war? And right after that, you had, 2006, you had a whole series of interesting meetings between the Saudi foreign ministers and the Israeli foreign minister. And, they kept accidentally and not on purpose meeting in airports all over the world and then having, short discussions with each other. But one of the things that the Saudis said to the Israelis, next time you fight Hezbollah, finish them off. Yes. Also, an expression that's been made about Hamas. Again, the Arabs know that the Salafists are their enemy. It is one of the principal barriers they have to modernization. But the Salafists, their player in the Palestinian community is Hamas, and once again they derail discussion away from the Palestinian Authority and have made it more militant.
Maybe something that you can help our viewers and those who are listening to the podcast understand a little bit better. Again, thank you for tuning in to our show today. We're talking with John C. Thompson about the Israeli-Hamas conflict that's happening, as we speak. One of the things that's hard for people to understand, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia and the pivot that's happened, or perhaps even what's happening with Iran, is of course the attack that took place that we now know happened from Israel into Iran using data breaches, etc., to try and overblow the reactor, and they were successful in doing so. They certainly stymied their nuclear project. Was that the moment that the Arab world knew it could trust Israel better than it could trust Iran? That Israel, which probably has nuclear weapons, they've never conceded that, but I mean, they could build those things like Tonka trucks, no problem. They have the intellectual capacity, they have the technology, they have the resources, so they have nuclear weapons. But the Iranians, they had to be prevented from doing this. Was that the proof, or was Israel just doing it for its own sake? Was it trying to prove something to the other Arab nations, or was it trying to just preserve itself?
Well, there are two interesting dimensions to this, again, which go back a long way. But remember in 1982, the Israeli Air Force flew a daring long-range strike into southern Iraq to blow up Saddam Hussein's first nuclear program. And accidentally and not on purpose, the Jordanian Air Force was not anywhere to be seen. And the Saudi Air Force was down the farther southern end of the country playing a major exercise, while the Israelis flew over Jordan, flew over Saudi airspace to enter into southern Iraq and bomb a nuclear reactor. So again, there's always been a pragmatism, a time when you cover off one eye and don't see what's going on. Another thing was like a very interesting discussion, because remember the threat of the Iranian nuclear weapon has been around for a while. But the last time I was in the West Bank talking to Palestinians, I remember this one conversation I had. A number of Palestinians are aware that, because they see it with Hamas all the time, that if you die as a result of a jihad, that's a good thing, you go to heaven. Which means that, as far as Hamas is concerned, or as far as the Iranians are concerned, collateral damage to Muslim populations is not something that troubles them. Again, there are Palestinians who know that. And I remember talking about the new emerging Iranian nuclear missiles that may have been coming up about 10 years ago. And I still remember talking to this one Palestinian, he just sort of pointed at the hills and he went, Jerusalem is right over there and my family's here. The Iranians won't care if they nuke Tel Aviv and we get killed by the fallout. Again, privately, they were encouraging the Israelis. They wanted the Israelis to act more strenuously against the Iranian nuclear project. There's a third thing to consider, and again, it's too subtle for most observers these days, especially the press. But the Saudis, again, are big believers in subtle diplomacy. 10 years ago, they bought a bunch of Chinese medium-range ballistic missiles, and they're based near Riyadh. They could reach Tel Aviv, yes, theoretically, but they selected a model that could also reach as far as Tehran. And that was a signal to the United States, we're prepared to get involved in nuclear escalation if you don't act and stop Iran from getting the nuclear weapon. Remember, the Saudis back in the 1970s were paying for the Pakistani bomb. So it wouldn't be too hard for the Saudis to go to Pakistan, buy a few warheads, and over a weekend become a nuclear power. But they're not threatening the Israelis with this. They're more concerned about Iran. So again, the whole issue about Iranian nuclear weapons is a lot more complicated.
What happened with Iran? I mean, we've all watched the movie. We're all aware that 1979 something went really sideways. Iran was a pretty liberal, even decadent place. The Shah of Iran, the relationship with British oil, British petroleum, to be precise. And of course, the fact of the matter was, it's Persia. It was this ancient, rich civilization that had lots of pagan roots long before it became Muslim or Christian, because there was lots of Christian and, for that matter, Jewish Persians as well. Than there still are today, actually, or at least the descendants of them. But the point is that Iran, or Persia, as it used to be called, was this rich culture, kind of a hangover going all the way back to Byzantium. It still had a lot of these trappings. And then out of nowhere in 1979, things just blew up. And we're now dealing with an Iran that wants to murder everybody and literally wants nuclear weapons to bring about the 12th Imam. What happened over there?
Well, how many times have you seen a very complicated rebellion or insurrection being totally derailed and captured by the extremists? That's an old lesson in history. I mean, remember, there were two revolutions in Russia, and the Bolsheviks took over. If you remember, to Nicaragua in 1979, they had the original rebel coalition, that overthrew Somoza, had all sorts of dimensions to it. But somehow or other, the Marxists took over both revolutions. In Iran, again, you had a whole collection of people who were opposed to the Shah and thought it was time to topple him. But the extremists took over. So, I mean, again, the Ayatollah Khomeini came back, and Khomeini is the Shia equivalent of a Salafist. In fact, he had, since the 1940s, been studying the Salafist movement and been copying them in many respects. So what you've got is the equivalent of, I hate to say this, a fusion of the Nazi Party or the Bolsheviks running Iran since 1979. And a lot of Iranians cannot wait for them to go. And if you look at the structure of modern Iran, you can see stuff, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's like the SS in Nazi Germany. They've got control of the police. They've got their own paramilitary organization that mirrors everything in the military. The Iranian military gets second call for recruits, second call for equipment, and is on the exterior of the country. The Revolutionary Guard Corps is based by every population center. That's just one of the examples. Big thing is, ordinary Iranians have shown their displeasure with the regime time and time and time again. But the regime is full of these, autocratic old bastards. And the people who've made a money and a living supporting the regime. So when the Iranians are, hitting the streets and protesting again, they get shot by the police because the cops are all part of the system. That's how they make their income. Most Iranians cannot wait for the mullahs to go. In fact, actually, here's one interesting thing that, again, most people don't realize about Iran, but the mullahs, especially the ones who are wearing a white turban, that signifies that they claim they're descended directly from Muhammad. So a lot of Iranians look at them and go, okay, how the hell do these Arabs get to end up running us? That's one of the things that comes up. The second thing is that the mullahs themselves have started to recognize that Iran, the first post-mullah Iran, might be something the world has waited for 14 centuries, a post-Muslim society. A lot of Iranians have been going back quietly to Zoroastrianism. I've talked to people who've done missionary work in Iran very, very carefully and underground. But there's a whole generation of Iranians that want nothing to do with Islam anymore. I remember some of them saying, if these guys are the perfection of Islam, then I'm out of it. It's gone. And so when the regime collapses, it'll be something the world has not seen before. But there's also 42 years of grievances that'll have to be worked out.
There's a whole bunch there to unpack, and we can come back to some of it in a little while. But one of the things that strikes me is that just like any empire, and especially any empire where there's a domination instead of a freely associating society, there's a Praetorian Guard that is taking care of those in charge, right? A reference to Rome, of course. The army is kept in the hinterland to ensure it does not rebel and doesn't take over the capital, and the Praetorian Guard is kept close to home to protect the emperor and his closest members and closest advisors. Something that kind of comes to mind, though, is if that's the case in Iran, then what went wrong in Iraq? Because as far as I can tell, Saddam Hussein, as far as a manager of his own people, brutal as he was, did manage to keep stability in his particular part of the region. Once he was gone, everything fell into complete chaos. And so regime change in Iraq didn't work. Why didn't they do regime change in Iran instead? Why were they focused on Iraq instead of Iran? And then what happened once they did take the regime out in Iraq?
Well, here's one of the curious things about Iraq. If you look at their history in the last, the 20 or 30 years since Saddam Hussein took over, Iraq was held together through state terror. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of people killed there every year. I mean, the Kurds were almost in a perpetual state of rebellion. You had all these other groups, the Marsh Arabs down in the bottom end of the Tigris-Euphrates were almost entirely exterminated. And Saddam Hussein was, again, from the Sunni population, which is a minority, ruling over a large Shia population, and doing so through coercion. The death rate in Iraq since Saddam Hussein was toppled is actually slightly down from a normal year under Saddam Hussein. For all the uproar and the terrorism and the civil violence we've seen, it's actually more peaceful than it was in a typical year under Saddam Hussein. And but again, this is a society that really shouldn't have been created. There should have been different boundaries drawn right after World War I.
Yes, all those colonial officers on a Tuesday afternoon in rainy England, just drawing away in their fanciful world. I recall from, of course, a book that I'm sure that you've referenced many times. I think one of the best books ever written on the subject, Paris, 1919, by Margaret Macmillan. In the introduction, they make a point that they had surveyors go out through Silesia and throughout East Prussia after the fall of Germany and after the defeat and the armistice. And they were surveying, and they were trying to figure out where they were going to draw the lines for Poland. They asked him if he was a Pole or a Hungarian or a Lithuanian, and he simply responded, "I am a Catholic of these parts."
Well, yeah, you go back right after the First World War, there was 3 different armed rebellions in Silesia over whether they're going to be Poles or Germans. And the grievances, there festered and were again played out in 1939.
Mm-hmm. coming back to the Middle East, so we have this this plethora of peoples, various ethnicities, various cultures, reaching back to literally the beginning of time, the cradle of civilization, prehistory, and all of history forward. Is some of it just in the soil? Maybe that sounds a bit fatalistic or deterministic, perhaps too philosophical, but is it just a crossroads of culture and conflict that in this Levant and in the Fertile Crescent, people are always going to be at odds and it ends? Or was there ever a time of stability and prosperity and peace? And can that be reached again in some of these areas?
That's a good question. It's an interesting one because again, you look historically, there's been peace usually imposed by an overwhelming outside power. But peace inside the Middle East, well, actually, Israeli society is quite peaceful. And there are some things that I hadn't been expecting to find when I first went there. But for example, Bedouin. You've got in various parts of Israel, you've got Bedouin who are not a part of any civil society, and in fact are actually live independent of the borders, camping in various places and moving back and forth. And Jordanians, Egyptians, Israelis, look at their movement and their passage, and that's the Bedouin. Nice to see someone keeping up the old ways and ignore them, or that used to be until the Salafists started recruiting among them. I've also, it's kind of interesting. Is one time I was in Israel, I was at a conference, and I was down in Herzliya, which, again, most people don't realize that Israel is really, even more than Southern California, a beach culture. And you've got a lot of beach there. Mm-hmm. But I was sort of, taking my notes that I'd taken because I'd been on the West Bank and in Jerusalem and East Jerusalem and Israel and talking to people again. And but here was my last days. And I had my laptop down, but I was watching and, all right, I'm a dirty old man. There were some very well-filled bikinis down on that beach. And, it was lovely to see. But I suddenly realized that these were...
They're God's people, John. So that's fine. I mean, God makes beautiful people, and his people are particularly beautiful. So there you go.
Well, the thing is, this was a bit of an epiphany that came up. There were Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. The Jews were boys and girls. The Arab Israelis were mostly boys. But, they were all on the beach. And I wondered, well, where are the Arab girls? And suddenly I looked up the path coming down from the town of Herzliya. And again, it was a whole mess of Arab girls who looked pretty much in a bikini like their Israeli cousins. But right behind them was Granny in traditional dress, coming along like a sheepdog with a herd of lambs. They came down to the beach. A young Jewish man basically found Granny a deck chair, offered it to her. She settled in, went to sleep. The girls went off in all directions, and you couldn't tell who was who in no time at all. Mm-hmm. And the epiphany was that leave them alone. Get the hate mongers out, and people will find their own solutions. And again, you look inside Israeli societies, there are a lot of Arab Israeli and Jewish Israeli families. They celebrate two traditions. There are in the schools, in the institutions, both people together working, and living side by side, getting along very harmoniously. It can happen if they're left alone. But the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, the only thing they can sell is hate. And that's all they've got. And they just keep pushing it and pushing it. And again, the Arabs who are living under their control can't protest because protest is fatal. So they just have to quietly go along. And some of them, again, are yearning for a different life. One of the most interesting people I talked to, the first time I was on the West Bank, was a Qadi, a Muslim traditional judge. And he was in hiding. He was actually in the Vatican enclave because he'd spoken out. And the Palestinian Authority, Arafat's people, were looking for him to kill him. Mm-hmm. But I still remember exactly what he said. And I can quote it exactly. Just remember that Rafah is the southwesternmost town in the Gaza Strip, and Jenin is the northeasternmost town in the West Bank. And he went, from 1970 to 1994, Arafat wasn't a part of our lives. He was off causing a civil war and trying to take over Jordan, causing a civil war in Lebanon, and running an international terrorist group. And we were quietly learning democracy from the Israelis in our towns and in the universities they built with us. Then he came back. And it used to be that tens of thousands of us were working for good money inside Israel, and now nobody is. Mm-hmm. And I could drive from Rafah to Jenin, and no one would stop me. And now there's 100 checkpoints. And the thing was, we weren't even asked if we wanted Arafat back. There was some sort of, consultative process tacked on to the Oslo Agreement, but that was like putting lipstick on a pig. That's... And hearing that from a Muslim
world and the Jewish world where you can't have pig, lipstick on pigs. That's funny. So if this is the case, if just leaving them alone would result in peace, why have we done interventionist movements, or did we not do enough intervention? I remember the beginnings of the Iraq War very clearly. I was only a child. I was 13 or so, but I remember very clearly the vigorous debates going on in the United States and in Canada. Of course, Canada opting to stay out of Iraq, having already gone into Afghanistan. But we've played around in Afghanistan. We certainly supported Iraq, not maybe in our own votes, but definitely sold armaments to the United States and to various players. Definitely did logistical support into Iraq. What were these regime changes worthwhile, or would people leaving them alone lessen the body count? If it's about leaving them alone, what point do you leave people alone? Do you help topple their dictators, or do you just hope and pray that someday democracy takes root?
Well, again, it's sort of interesting, but actually remember, regime change is America's sucker bet. They can't resist. And if you go back in American history, I think there's an incident around 1820 where, one of the first Royal American Navy ships is in the South Pacific, in some of the islands at the time. I think it was Samoa, the Samoan Islands or so on. And the Navy officer writing back to Congress going, I came in and they now have a Congress and president and, all's good. In other words, he went in among, the Pacific Islanders and imposed an American-style government, which of course fell apart the moment his ship disappeared over the horizon again. But if you look at the Americans, the number of times they've interfered thinking they're improving things. And again, you look at Iraq when in 2003, when they moved in, they just couldn't resist. The original idea was to basically pull off, what they call, the British used to call a butcher and bolt in the 19th century when they go into Afghanistan. Standing jump, this is Rumsfeld's original idea, was a standing jump by surprise from pre-stocked military equipment in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, go to Baghdad in a weekend, and then come back. In other words, basically say, Saddam, you cannot defend your society. You're helpless. Behave, or we'll come get you.
So a raid done, but at the level of a world army, not just a platoon.
Yeah, and a corps, basically 50,000 troops, but with pre-stocked equipment, no warning, jump, and gone. And just, a reminder, behave, we can get you anytime. But no. Again, all the other advisors in the Bush administration had to, we can improve this and change that and build this and create a new wonderful democracy. No, it was a mistake. And it's America's sucker bet, and they keep making it. And we probably would have been, chasing Saddam Hussein might have been a lot more stable in the long run.
So we have we have the Iraq example, and then we have the Afghanistan example. So in Iraq, what you had was, again, no question, a butcher, a terrible human being, essentially keeping the post-colonial borders, the post-World War I borders together of this formerly British protectorate by sheer force of will and terror and some very terrible acts, but nonetheless keeping it together. And there was a functional society, deeply evil, functional. In Afghanistan, you have kind of an opposite situation. You have a bunch of tribal leadership and really various debates on the loyalty of the various Pushtun and whoever else is running around with a bizarre little, arm that goes all the way to China on that river valley there. A very bizarre little place. And then on top of all of that, you try and get in there and take out you're trying to find Osama bin Laden, supposedly, though I think everybody knew he was in Pakistan to begin with. But the point is that if you're trying to do this and you're trying to impose a democracy on this tribal situation that's still living as if it is the 14th or 15th century, what was that? That was never going to work either. But why did they fail? They failed differently. They both failed. But what happened in Afghanistan versus what happened in Iraq?
Well, what happened in Afghanistan is the same thing that always happens in Afghanistan. There was a whole mess of bump when the Afghan invasion was first proposed in 2001, graveyard of empire, blah, 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 blah. Actually, no, Afghanistan is very easy to invade. It's very easy to occupy. Problem is, there's no incentive for staying there. So after a while, you get bored at the cost and you leave. And that's, the Persians, the Mongols, the British, even the Russians, and us, and the Americans and their allies went in, occupied Afghanistan, couldn't stabilize it, and are leaving. It's all the Afghans, the hillbillies, especially in the South, have to do is outwait whoever's in the towns in the lowlands. And that's the same thing they've done for 1,000 years.
And for 1,000 years, Afghanistan has been unconquerable. We all know that. It features all the way to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. That's where, of course, Dr. Watson was stationed. He was in Afghanistan during that British version of Afghanistan, a century and a bit before the current British version of Afghanistan. If we were never going to get anywhere with Afghanistan, and if we had literally history going all the way back to Alexander the Great explaining that Afghanistan was unconquerable, why did we do this?
Well, again, originally it's trying to defeat the Taliban, hunt down Al-Qaeda, and then leave. But once again, the American sucker bet kicked in. Let's build a modern nation state. That's like playing Legos with wearing boxing gloves. You're just not putting the pieces together. It's not going to happen.
Does Afghanistan have an industry other than opium?
Well, being themselves,
Fair. I think that was the other half of it. Is as I learned more about the Afghanistan war, I kind of sat there and thought to myself, wait a minute. Like, even if you were to build a modern nation state in Afghanistan, I don't think they're going to start pumping out the equivalent of a Toyota or even a Lada tomorrow. What would they sell? But the thing is, they're already selling it. They grow poppies in Afghanistan, and they sell an awful lot of poppies and the product thereof, which of course is opium and heroin.
Well, remember though, there are also sections of Afghanistan trapped by the borders that were drawn by others. There are people who speak, Persian. There are people who speak, Tajik. There are people whose affinities go with Central Asia or Persia. And then you've got, the Pashto, whose affinities are also in northwestern Pakistan, who are basically, they are a law unto themselves. People who've always been there. And I remember talking to a friend of mine, is a Canadian military officer, and I think he has 3 Afghan medals on him. He'd been there, did 3 tours. But before the first tour, they were consulting with people who'd come out of Afghanistan here in Canada. What do we do? And this one girl had talked to him, and she said, well, I come from Afghanistan. I know that society very well. Said, if you go into that area, you're going to end up in these little old villages talking to little old men who will nod and smile, and nothing will ever change. If you want to change things, you have to kill them all. And he's, we can't do that. That's not the solution. She said, okay, well, it's not going to change. And it hasn't.
I mean, it was an interesting pivot by the Trump administration in its last year that they were now negotiating with the Taliban to try and get a peace deal and get out. We've been there for 20 years. Obviously, Canada has decamped from Afghanistan, though I'm sure there's still various operations going on in Afghanistan that we don't get told about. But the official line is that Canada has gotten out of Afghanistan. And the Americans are still there. It's been 20 years. This is going on longer than Vietnam. What are we gaining at this point? Why is anyone still there? If everybody left tomorrow, it'll all go back to the way it was, and we can just admit that we wasted a lot of blood and treasure. But what did we learn from our experience as Canadians? What are we learning as the West from this experience?
Well, in the Canadian Army, it was their first practical experience in counterinsurgency since the Riel Rebellion in 1885. That's about it, really. A lot of different method, a lot of different tactics, experience, but in the long run, it's sort of a lot of people who'd been in Afghanistan are saying, we thought we were doing good, but nothing good that we did has lasted. The schools that were built for girls are now sheltering goats. That's just the way of it. So I mean, what did we do there? Well, for one brief shining moment, Camelot was flowering. It was a possibility that we could create a modern Afghanistan that allowed the country to stand up on its own feet. And Afghan history reasserted itself.
And history perpetuated itself. With the death of Osama bin Laden, I believe that was 2011 was when they caught him. Well, caught him, killed him, got him, shipped him off to sea. The thing is that it felt anticlimactic because it didn't end anything. We're still there 10 years later. And what is the answer? If you've captured and killed, whether it's Hosni, there was Hosni Mubarak, there was Saddam Hussein. Like there's been a capture and kill of several wicked people in the last 20-25 years, and various assassinations of the last one was Soleimani in January of 2020. They managed to get him with a drone strike. So these evil actors are taken out, but has anything improved? Has anything changed? Just drone warfare or assassinations or even these pushed or insurrections or supported regime changes, are they actually making the world a better place, or is it really the result of the military-industrial complex?
If you go back far enough, you could have the same conversation with a captain of the Pharaoh's charioteers, working in, below, in the Upper Nile. You could have the same discussion with a Roman legionary coming back from the Roman frontiers, with a Chinese crossbowman from the wall. What good are we doing? Well, ultimately, I mean, again, what we saw with bin Laden is, if you're not occasionally policing in these areas and keeping an eye on real troublemakers, the trouble that is in the outside areas will come back and get you. That was the point about Afghanistan. It got so unstable. There was like 1.5 million refugees in the Western world. Opium had become the national industry. And you had all these terrorist groups that were running their bases there. And so if you're not policing them, and you have to police them occasionally by going in and, doing the equivalent of hitting people with a truncheon, trouble is going to come and get you. But that is also the price of civilization, and that's the price for the pharaohs, for the Romans, for the Chinese, for the British, and for us. You've got to get involved sometimes, but to try and stay, that's a lot more expensive, and it doesn't work. And again, it goes right back to the West Bank, or goes to the Iranians. There is, a desire, a strong desire to improve, to actually modernize, to set these conflicts aside. And there are really good people on the West Bank who are trapped by that conflict, and they can't do anything about it. But if we impose a solution on them, it won't work. But stand back, and maybe when they reach for their own solution, we do what we can to help. Someday, it's actually interesting. Again, if you want to compare the Palestinians with the Israelis, look at the residents of the presidents of the countries. This palace built over Ramallah that Abbas lives in. And remember that, again, his sticky fingers and the sticky fingers of his officials have diverted money from everything, to their own accounts. Or you look at the palace or the residence of the Israeli president, much more humble, much more modest. There's a big difference. And someday, the Palestinians are going to come after the likes of Abbas and the rest of them and get rid of them. There are Palestinians who really want to have normalized relations with Israel, to work, to be able to freely visit hospitals, to no longer have the checkpoints. But they can't do it as long as they have their leaders. And again, remember, Hamas took over in the Gaza Strip. They killed hundreds of Palestinian authority figures. It is a violent interlopers that are in there. I mean, Hamas has got no legitimacy except what it has at its gunpoint. So, I mean, the people who are going on about Hamas and thinking that somehow that these guys are legitimate rulers of Gaza Strip have no idea of what the Gaza Strip is like and what Hamas has done there.
Something that occurs to me is that maybe we can talk a little bit about those multifaceted dimensions a bit more when it comes to the Syrian conflict. The Syrian conflict is complicated, to put it politely, and it's been going on now for several years. So it's hard to really know what the initial instance was. But we have the Arab Spring come to light. We have Bashar al-Assad be challenged in his authority. He looks like he's going to lose. There will be this sort of almost like the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. It was that multifaceted, for that matter. You have international actors, you got like weapons coming in from God knows where, you got people who are anarchists, you got people who are theocrats. Like it's all over the place. But the point is that you have this beginning. And everything looked so hopeful for a few minutes there. And then it felt like the Obama administration wouldn't back up, at least who appeared in the media to be the good guys, though who knows if they were, or the Kurds, and which are not the same people. And then it all just fell apart. And it looks like the Kurds are going to get squished into a thimble and thrown into the sea. What happened here?
Well, if you look back at 2011, 2012, when the trouble in Syria started, what I thought at the time was that actually the best thing could actually do was to stand back and let Assad do what he's always done. Because you actually remember that Syria is, most of the Syrian population are Sunni Arabs. Assad was based on a ruling coalition of Druze, and again, his own particular Shia Twelvers, people that lived high up in the mountains in Western Syria. And historically, these people have been persecuted quite viciously by the lowland Arabs, except that, when the Workers' Party, sort of the regime, as it matured, these minorities got into power. And actually, they were part of the coalition that supported Assad. Now, the thing is, that whole Arab Spring and the idea of democracy, yeah, there were people who were talking about democracy. But if you look at the real rebels that were actually trying to overthrow Assad at the time, the Salafists had come out. The same people that were behind Al-Qaeda and everything else. And if they won, they would end up massacring the Druze, massacring the Maronite Christians, massacring the Shia up in the mountains. It could have killed 1 million people. So maybe it would be best to let Assad do what he was doing. Except that, of course, outside influences kept coming in on both sides. And again, your analogy of the Spanish Civil War is very apt. It is very apt. You had the Nazis and the Soviets busy, running things, moving their arms in, providing advisors, and away you go. So it's now been 9 years of a nonstop conflict. In fact, actually, the one positive thing you can say about Assad is that he is sort of behaving a little bit like Franco, who had to listen to what the Nazis and the fascists from Italy were saying. But maybe he's got his own private agenda that he isn't going to be part of a larger system. But Iran is all over his regime right now. And, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hezbollah. One good thing about the civil war in Syria is it's killed a lot of members of Hezbollah and killed a lot of Revolutionary Guard Corps types. That's actually weakened their hold in some respects on both Lebanon and Iran, respectively.
And something else that's kind of to note there too, just with the direct correlation to what happened with the Spanish Civil War, is the big international element. Of course, the reason we know so much about the Spanish Civil War isn't just from the other documentation; it's from the personal stories of those who had come from first world countries, other countries throughout the West, and went and served in the Spanish Civil War, mostly on the left wing side, but in both in various parts of the Middle East, but especially in the Syrian conflict, as we've seen. With returning freedom fighters, or were they returning terrorists? We don't know. But there have been many international people, not just ethnically connected with the region, but people who just felt that they needed to stand in solidarity with what was going on there for good or bad reasons. And they went and found their way into Syria and joined militias and participated in the war. So there's a real direct correlation there as well.
Yeah, there's the equivalent of the international brigades. And again, it's an ugly situation because it is an ideological war. It's also very much a racialist war. It's Arabs against Maronites and Druze. It's you also have the players who are supported by the Turks, the players who are supported by the Iranians. Some of the players are supported by the Saudis or by Saudi money, and the Americans interfering. Again, very ineptly, especially under Obama, and making trouble worse. And of course, you had the Americans were still there under Trump, and he was looking for a way of getting out. But it's a mess, and there was an easy idea, an easy solution in 2011, but that's not popular with statesmen. The idea that you stand back and let things take their natural course. It's actually kind of reminds me, I guess, the first time I was in the West Bank, I made a lot of use of a driver translator that I had to search for very carefully because I didn't want one that was hired by the PA and would be taking me on a Potemkin tour. I wanted to be able to talk to, the store clerks and waiters and sort of ordinary people on my own. And I found someone who could handle it. But the time we spent together was something like an education for him. And of course, he was also concerned because at that time, the Israelis were putting up a security fence, a wall, if there was a risk of a sniper firing into Israel or offense in more general areas. But I think he'd learned something about some of his own people from the questions I was asking and where I was looking. And I still remember when driving back into Jerusalem, and I was, my next stop after that was Tel Aviv. But he said, do you think there's ever going to be peace between us? I said, I think so, but maybe the wall has to go up first, because this is when the second Intifada was underway and things were a little too tense. And again, I remember his quote very well. He said, there's one thing I really hate. And next time we're talking with Israelis, can we just find one intermediary that we both trust, to handle negotiations for both of us? I'm tired of all these people running in, trying to get a Nobel Peace Prize and stamping all over the place and making a mess. It was interesting, that this was a young man. He was about 10 years younger than me at the time, with a family, but he had just seen so many people rushing in and, the roadmap to peace and trying to impose something in the hope that they somehow or other get international recognition for solving something that was unsolvable. When actually, if you stood back and let people find their own solution, it was possible.
Something that I wanted to ask you about right from the start, and I'm glad we're getting to it now, is what does strategic thinking look like when it comes to a Canadian perspective on these things? Obviously, we have large minority populations from some of these regions. We also have our own rest of populations here, of populations fundraising for causes back home. Last time you and I were discussing on the show here, we did talk about how Canada has always been a recruiting ground for insurgency, or the money to help with insurgency. Right-wing, left-wing, communist, fascist, nationalist. Today, there are people who get charged with funding, trying to fund for the ethno state at home. What does strategic thinking look like when it comes to that? When you were involved with this, what did it talk about? Was it just game theory? Was it honest discussions of like the nuts and bolts of how many hulls are out there, how many tanks? Was it more around, well, we just don't want the Russians to take over the Arctic? What is strategic thinking when it comes to Canada, a place that's the second largest country in the world, but not exactly known for having a very large or well-equipped armed forces, given our lack of procurement strategy?
Thank you, because I now have a chance to take a cheap shot at our current government, which deserves every cheap shot they can collect. But the traditional Canadian view of our security policy has actually been based on the First World War and the Second World War. You look at all this idea of peacekeeping and everything else, and the whole baby blue UN thing and so on. That wasn't altruism. That wasn't Boy Scouts with rifles. That was actually our naked self-interest, is that we don't want regional problems getting out of hand and creating a wider war that drags us in, so that we lose another 45,000 or 65,000 people and threaten our government stability for decades. That's why we're there, and that's why we're interested in this thing and keeping an eye on these regional problems. That is Canadian security policy in a nutshell. Keep these problems from getting too big. But the other side of things, we've seen now that the trouble between the Gaza Strip and the shelling of cities in Israel has led to demonstrations here where, again, Canadian Jews got physically attacked. And there are people who've been getting all sorts of hate mail. Because, again, you've got, those romantics on the left who somehow or other think this is a simple morality play of good versus evil. And it proves, they could not be any more wrong. And, of course, the other thing is the religious side of things, because we got Salafists here. We got plenty of Salafists here. So, this has already created some instability inside the country. And we really got to be paying attention to this. But in the long run, the stability in the Middle East is going to rest with Israel. Their technology, their prosperity, their stability guarantees everybody else. Because remember, Israel is the main point for Arabs who are worried about Iran. That they want to have good relations with Israel. Israel is the element of stability. And what you're seeing now by the PA and by Hamas is trying to overwhelm that stability, trying to destroy it. So things can be as chaotic as ever because they personally find it profitable.
Maybe just before we go back into the region itself, we can talk a little bit about the fact that for some reason, the Grits, the Liberals in Canada, the Democrats in the United States, whenever regimes change hands, to say our own regimes, our own governments, somehow, Harper and the Tories, they were always clear where they stood. They stood with Israel. Right? That was it. That was clear. That was what was going to happen. When you get Justin Trudeau involved, Justin Trudeau is making pivots towards some rather unsavory parts of the Muslim Canadian world and the Islamic Congress. This is not, of course, a denigration of anyone of the Muslim faith. But it's a statement of fact that people of dubious character or intent are very close to this current prime minister. And the same is true of the Democrat president in the United States. How did this happen? How did it happen that left-wing governments throughout the West just came to side with the Palestinian Authority and with any enemy of Israel, and somehow right-wing governments throughout the West have remained faithful to Israel?
Well, I think the first thing is that most political thinking is not that deep. And for the left, for the progressive side, I hate to say this, but cowboys and Indians. It's a simple morality play. Here are the Israelis, a modern nation state, and it looks like they're cracking down on the Palestinians. All the complexities of an asymmetrical relationship, 100 years of history, all the different dimensions escape them. It looks like a simple morality play. And so the only engagement with it is emotional. It's not logical. In fact, actually, it's one of the things you've seen a lot of media commentary is sort of ignore this, ignore that, ignore this. It all boils down to this. Well, no, it doesn't. It actually demands that you have some education. Well,
that you be informed.
Yeah, and Biden is, I'm afraid to say this, but yeah, it looks like he doesn't keep his concentration any longer than about 2 minutes. And Trudeau is the worst educated, worst briefed, worst prepared prime minister we've had since 1867. I mean, bar none. There's been no one worse than him. And that is very clear. They are not experts in any part of diplomacy, and that is a major problem. The other side of, I guess, it's progressive credentials. Again, the Palestinians, the PA got to play a lot with the Soviet bloc. They've got very good progressive qualifications if you don't look that closely. So once again, there's sort of the natural allegiance there. And the third thing, of course, is domestic politics. Sometime around 2006, 2007 in Canada, the Jewish vote became smaller than the Muslim vote. So in Canada, you've got all sorts of politicians paying attention to what they think are Muslim issues without, again, being that well educated. Because, again, it's a history in Canada that politicians are often not paying that much attention to the details. There are, for example, Iranians. Many Iranian Canadians would love Canada to list the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist entity. But, somehow that would be, might affect the Iranian vote. There's this idea that somehow or other there is a monolithic Muslim vote, a monolithic Arab vote, and the belief that there is. And so you get the very simple solution for a problem to try and appeal to people, and they're not even considering any of the details in there.
I think it's funny that we still entertain the idea that there is a monolithic vote anywhere. I mean, I'm sure that just as if multiculturalism was real, that would mean that we would all mix all of our various ideas all the time. Perhaps we'd keep our somewhat ethnic and religious belonging, but we would wear different clothes, we'd go to different restaurants, and we would all be able to have a small L liberal sort of attitude towards issues of our time, and kind of live out the values of the Enlightenment. It's kind of ironic that it is our most left-wing, supposedly progressive parties that stereotype the worst on this count. And further to that, I think, particularly when it comes to the Revolutionary Guard and other things, like, I mean, here at home, the reason people are here is they wanted to escape the things that were going wrong in the home country. So why would you pivot to that thing that they obviously were trying to walk away from? I don't think there's any Syrian refugees that are missing barrel bombs and want to live in a time of terror and unrest.
Well, it's this is one thing I've always noticed, is someone who claims there's a monolithic community, like the Black community will not stand for, or the First Nations community will not stand for, or the Arab community will not stand for this, is usually someone representing themselves, because there is no such community, except in their own minds and in the mind of the more credulous among us. Because again, when I talk about the Middle East, I say that there's different layers, there's different complexities, there's whole backgrounds, there's much to consider. But that's true for just about everything. So when someone comes along trying to sell you a solution that will fit the entire community, it's usually a solution that's going to fit them. Yes. And they claim they're representing the entire community. And that's usually the point where you should stop trusting them altogether and escort them out of the office and tell your secretary, I don't want to talk to that guy ever again.
Yeah, I've got a monorail to sell you there, John. We'll go through all of Edmonton. We'll get.
Famous episode of The Simpsons. Every time I see the LRT site under construction, I start thinking the monorail song from that Simpsons episode.
The monorail.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's that brilliant thing, right? I mean, I used to say this about vitamins. This isn't trying to denigrate anybody who thinks that vitamins are the greatest thing ever, but I always thought that if people were silly enough to buy them and urinate out 98% of the materials in the vitamins, you should tell them that was a silly thing to do. But I also never believed that I should ban the manufacture of them. I should just shame people into being such terrible people that they would sell these to people. Like, I don't know if I'm a libertarian. I'm just a moralist. Like, I just feel like shame would be enough on both sides to get the job done. I don't need to build a regime to outlaw vitamins. That's a waste of time and money. Let's get back to the Middle East just briefly here and just kind of close out on just the reality of this conflict that we have on our hands right now. And maybe first we could touch on the Kurd situation. We'll talk about that first, John. What is happening with the Kurds? Because as far as I could tell, out of all the other stuff that was happening when it came to the Syrian conflict, the Kurds were kind of indisputably the good guys. That seemed to be the one thing that everybody else seemed to be on the same page with. And then they just kind of disappeared from the news. So did they actually get crushed by the Turks, or what happened to the Kurds?
Well, remember that there are Kurds in Iran, Kurds in Iraq, Kurds in Syria, Kurds in Turkey. And Iran has repressed the Kurds many times. Iraq has repressed the Kurds many times. The Turks, are absolutely murderous. But of course, the other sad thing is that after a while, we got bored. We stopped paying attention to the Kurds. The Kurds are in the same situation, the same trouble they've always been in. Now, they do have sort of a de facto quasi-state of their own in northern Iraq. But again, the Iranians and the Turks would both like to close that down. And we would be paying more attention, but the Western public got bored and tuned it out, as happens. It's too complex, it's too many details. We've heard it too often. There are other things to pay attention to. And usually it means that someone else to be entirely ignorant of it.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately the only solution I kind of had to that situation was that there should be a Kurdish state. But of course, I'm kind of slipping into post-World War I thinking there again. of we'll just make all these little ethno states in Europe. That'll go fine. I'm sure that'll all work out just fine. And we all know how that worked out in the end. So,
well, it's interesting. A friend of mine asked for. I kind of accidentally wrote a chronology of the Second World War, and I backdated it to November 11th, 1918, because so many issues in the First World War started with the creation of these miniature ethnic states. So if you want to know why the Germans were so vicious when they closed in on the Poles in 1939, they were picking up the book that was written in 1919 and writing the next chapter in it. If the Kurds had got their own state, in the Paris Accords, well, one, where would it have access to the world's ocean and international trade? But yeah, would that have solved a lot of problems today? There'd be problems that would be missing. On the other hand, the Kurds would be in border conflicts in every direction anyway. Some problems just aren't that solvable, not that easily. All you can do is basically, I guess with the Kurds case, is make sure they've got enough to defend themselves and that no one can persecute them with the same freedom that they used to have.
As we kind of close out here, John, again, coming back to the issue at hand, when the conflict inside of Israel right now, between Israel, Gaza, between the state of Israel, and of course Hamas, the question of the day, I guess, is still is this gonna escalate, or are they going to be able to calm it back down, bring down the rockets, keep the Iron Dome going, and just have this kind of peter out the way it's petered out before? Or is this going to rise, especially with the weak administration in the United States, let alone our weak administration here, and with everybody preoccupied with COVID, is this going to get out of hand? Is this not necessarily the big one, but is it the stepping stones to the big one, because no one's paying attention, everyone's looking the other way?
Well, here's something interesting for you. Remember, in 2006, Hamas picked a fight with Israel and showered thousands of rockets in the northern third of Israel. It killed a lot of Israeli civilians. It was the first time that this had happened. And Hezbollah has got maybe 70,000 rockets. They've got just as many rockets and of the same type and from the same source as Hamas does. But the point is that Hezbollah has not salvoed those tens of thousands of rockets into northern Israel yet. And why is that? I'll tell you why. Most of the leaders of Hezbollah have built themselves very nice homes in some of the best parts of Lebanon. And the Israelis know where they live. So you spend 8 months getting that pool extension just perfect, and you want to start firing Fahir rockets at Jerusalem, there's going to be a 1,000-pound smart bomb to the roof of your pool. So they don't. It's important for Hezbollah to look like they threaten Israel, but to actually really threaten Israel, no, they don't. Hamas, however, the leaders, when they don't live elsewhere outside of Gaza, they have their bunkers, they have their buildings, and they make sure they're surrounded by lots and lots of Gazans. Children and women, put the multiple rocket launcher in the alleyway between an orphanage and a hospital and start firing. It's harder to solve because, again, Hamas is, anyone who's killed, in a result of the Israeli counter bombardment is a martyr, and that's a good thing. Welcome. The main point is, can the Israelis get at Hamas and get their leadership and get a large number of their troops? Well, a large number of their troops are underground, and a lot of their leaders are well hidden. So it takes a while for the Israelis to find them. But, there's talk about, 200 dead and so on and so forth. And, a lot of people forget how this happened. And this was actually a very, very cunning ploy by the Israelis on Thursday last week, where they got on social media and tweeted that the Israeli army was about to close into Gaza. And, they showed pictures of equipment and talked about how they're just about to invade Gaza. So a lot of Hamas went in underground to the tunnels so that they could start firing anti-tank rockets and mortars at the supposed invading Israelis. And it was a ploy. It meant they got in the tunnels away from the built-up, mostly away from the built-up areas, and started moving to where they thought the Israelis were coming. And the Israelis launched a massive airstrike, 150 aircraft with ground-penetrating bombs. They may have actually killed a lot more than 200. It may be 500 or 600. Who knows? They crushed a lot of tunnels. But again, Hamas, as far as they're concerned, they've lost 19-year-old, 20-year-old men. There's plenty more where they came from. The key thing is, can the Israelis find their leaders and stop their money?
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point, because there's more dimensions to this. And until they do, this is going to limp along. But the Israeli defenses against rockets coming out of Hamas are pretty good. I mean, the Iron Dome intercepts about 90% of them. There are other defenses. Civil engineering is good. But the problem is Israel is being bombarded by a non-nation state actor, which is to say it's not responsible to anybody. Mm-hmm. And it's also hard. I mean, imagine any other country on earth that would put up with being regularly bombarded.
No, they would they'd blast them into existence.
I mean, it's the point. If someone was doing this in the United States, how patient would the Americans be, or the Russians, or the Chinese? So this is going to, I think, go on for a little while. But I think if the Israelis start making the
I think we might have lost John there. We'll see if he comes back. Just a little bit of freezing there. But we were going to close out the show pretty quickly here anyways, but we'll let John come back if he does come back. I think something to kind of interject here is that to the point of how are we going to find the Palestinian leaders and that sort of thing, or how is Israel going to deal with that and whatever. I'll say this. If there's one thing that I've learned from any number of spy movies and conversations with ex-military guys, etc., it is that, people used to joke about dealing with the CIA. People didn't joke so much about dealing with the KGB or the MI5. But if there is a group of people you do not want to mess with, that is Mossad. And that's the Israeli special forces / intelligence people in Israel and throughout the world. Let's be clear. They are everywhere. You don't want to mess with those people. They don't make jokes and they don't send their message twice. You get it once or you don't get it at all because you're not waking up. So all I have to say is that whoever is in the Palestinian Authority, if you value your own skin, I would very much encourage you to stop firing rockets into Israel, because they will find you and you will not exist anymore. So I think that's an important point to leave on for that conversation. If John returns, like I said, we'll have him back on in a moment, but we're about to close out the show anyways. We're in the last 10 minutes, pivoting from questions of the Middle East and conflicts within our within the wider world. We'll talk a little bit about the unrest that's happening in Canada over COVID. My dearest beloved just sent me an article that she had discovered on CTV News. We both take a lot of umbrage with COVID and the various restrictions thereof, particularly the mask thing. I don't know if you want to put us as anti-maskers or something like that, but I think it's more fair to say that we have doubts about their efficacy, to use that turn of phrase, and perhaps also that circular question: if the masks work, why the social distancing? If the social distancing works, why the mask? If the plexiglass works better than both, why either? And finally, if you get vaccinated and you still have to wear the mask, what was the point of the vaccine? So anyways, apparently, this is coming to us from CTV, a license suspension, garnishment of wages, jail time possible for those with unpaid public health order tickets. And this is coming out of Regina. This has been discussed in British Columbia as well. So I'm not sure if, sorry, I made a little ding there. I'm not sure if, where everybody's tuning in from. But here in British Columbia, there's also been discussions that as you renew your license, not particularly your insurance, I don't know if they're able to kind of trace it that quickly, but as you go to renew your license and that sort of thing, you could be blocked from getting your license back, or perhaps you'll be paying your parking tickets and your speeding tickets, just like when you go to renew your license, renew your insurance. You'll have to pay your COVID fines too. Now, of course, COVID fines can range anywhere from, I think, a simple $600 fine or $300 fine for failing to wear a mask inside of a store or whatever that is, all the way up to the $2,000 and $3,000 mark. And again, this article citing, and again, this would be provincial authority because health orders are provincial, just as ticketing is provincial. We see again here garnishment of wages. I'm trying to imagine again. Let's just go back in time, right? Let's jump in a time machine and let's go back a very, very, very short time. Okay, today is the 18th of May. The 18th of May. And the lockdown in BC basically started the day after St. Patrick's Day, and St. Patrick's Day is the 17th of March, I believe. So March 17, 2020 to today is 12 months, and then March, April, and May. So we're at 14 months for that in British Columbia. And if you had told me on St. Patrick's Day of 2020 that was what was going to happen, I wouldn't have believed you. I wouldn't have believed you even a little bit. We're going to pivot back to John here, and we're going to close out our section on this question of the Middle East. It's good to have you back, John. Israel, you were talking about the salvos into Israel, and the point that I just made just as you were gone there for a little while. We talked about COVID briefly, but if I was the Palestinian Authority, I definitely wouldn't be, or Hezbollah or Hamas for that matter, I wouldn't be trying to get into Israel's face, because if there's one group of people that scare me like none other, it's Mossad. Mossad does not take prisoners, and they will find you and they will get you. So I don't know why anybody thinks they're going to get away with this anywhere. I think that Mossad will eventually find the leaders of Hamas, and a very brutal example will be made of them.
Well, the Israelis have a lot of intelligence deployed opposite the Gaza Strip from all their different agencies. That's one of the issues, is that they're always looking for Hamas leaders. And a lot of the core leadership of Hamas doesn't live in the Gaza Strip anymore. They lived in Damascus, they live in some other states. But it also explains, like, when the Israelis talk about how they're hesitant to attack buildings, because they're often trying to get the people in the Gaza Strip to leave before they level a building. But again, you look at a couple of the towers, especially I think the AP tower, the tower that had the AP offices in it. If you look at the footage, there was secondary explosions. Hamas probably had a store of rockets underneath the building, and the Israeli bomb set that store off. It again talks to Hamas and basically how careless they are with the lives of the people they claim to be representing. But Hamas has killed a lot more people in the Gaza Strip than the Israelis ever have.
And that fact alone should compel people. But again, people aren't told that narrative. They're told as if Israel is dropping bombs from the sky on innocent school children just playing in a yard somewhere. That's all, and that's all they do. They don't do anything else. There's only those victims and none others.
Well, also another sign of the insanity of Hamas. Remember that Hamas gets electricity. The Gaza Strip gets its electricity and its water from Israeli sources, and they've been shelling them. How smart is that? Again, they talk about how their hospitals are overcrowded. Well, that's because their hospitals are also understaffed and under-equipped, because the money that's come in for hospitals has stuck to the fingers of Hamas officials. So their hospitals are inadequate. And again, a long part of the history of Hamas, of the Gaza Strip, is that a lot of their wounded might end up being treated in Israeli hospitals again, which are being shelled from the Gaza Strip. I mean, Hamas is not a rational enemy, and no one should ever think that they are.
It is absolutely mind-boggling that people can kind of get themselves into this cognitive dissonance, no matter what your feelings might be towards a particular ethnicity or whatever. It just, again, your very survival depends on this other group of people. Why would you bite the hand that feeds you?
Well, yeah, you're not rational. And this is the one thing I learned, from the 2 trips on the West Bank and the many times I've talked to Palestinians, is that the rational people among them are hoping for an end to the conflict, and they know that their own leadership is the barrier towards peace. So, they can start working with the Israelis. The problem is that the leadership among the Palestinians, Hamas or the PA, I mean, their sole card is hatred of Israel, and they're not rational, and they've done incalculable harm to their own people, time and time again.
And to what end? I mean, they are no freer, they are no better off. Since the Palestinian Authority, things have gone worse for them. So it's not this. This is nonsense. And since the terrorist groups took over, but this is nonsense, and this aggression will not stand. I believe is a certain phrase used by a certain senior Bush at one point, and I have a sneaking suspicion that that fire and fury will rain down upon Hamas rather soon.
Well, there's one last point to consider, and of course, as Westerners, we always look at an issue like Israel and Hamas in terms of right and wrong. You've had that discussion many times about the legal history of Israel and whether or not and this was moral and so on. These are important questions, especially to Israelis. But remember, in Arab culture, especially with the Palestinians, right and wrong doesn't come into it. Honor and shame is a more important construct. And this also explains part of the motivation is that as far as the Palestinians are concerned, they're shamed. And the only way they can redeem their honor is by humiliating Israel. Mm-hmm. And so if you think there's actually going to be a rational and legal end to this crisis, no. It's going to have to be when Palestinians themselves make the choice that they've done enough. It's time, it's failed. It's time to go and move on and do something else. But they can't do it with the current crop of leaders that they have.
Mm-hmm. An escalation of commitment, I believe Sheldon Clare called it not too long ago, president of the National Firearms Association. You get stuck in your codependency and there's no way out. So hopefully the people in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, all Palestinians everywhere find a way to not necessarily just fold into Israeli society. They have a distinct culture, they have a distinct background, a distinct religion, but they can separate themselves from the people who are clearly abusing them and outright enslaving them and using them for human shields.
Yeah, using their children and warping them, stealing off all the wealth that flows into the country and for their own personal profit.
Absolutely. John, thank you so much for joining us today and just regaling us with your expertise and helping us understand better an incredibly complicated situation, perhaps the most complicated in international affairs, the Middle East and the current conflict in Gaza and Israel. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. We'll, of course, have John on again in the near future, and we're very thankful for his expertise and what he can share with us. As we close out our show today, again, I just want to refer back to this point that was, again, sent by my beloved to me, who I want it to be very clear. She's way out of my league, and I have no idea why she's with me, but we'll talk about that another time. The point is that as we look at this situation where they are literally going to garnish wages and prevent you from exercising your privileges and or rights. I mean, we've already been down this road with assembly and your free speech and apparently going and worshiping in a church. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. COVID communism is here, hopefully not to stay. But we're in the midst of some very serious, trespasses against our liberties. And now apparently here comes the final stick for the various carrot of obeying the authorities because we said so. And that is that they will take your money from you. They will take it out of your own two hands. I mean, the libertarians going off with taxation is theft. I mean, they had a grand old time with that argument for a lot of years. But this is something more sinister. It's something more insidious, right? How you wish to respond to this virus outside from somebody literally, purposely spreading it with intent, whatever the nature of the virus might be. We're not making a declarative statement here about that. But the point is that outside of literally, trying to procure the virus and then spread the virus to other people, perhaps not even to yourself, like trying to spread it to yourself, that'd be a different question. And indeed, that used to be the way that we inoculated people. I'm old enough to remember people socializing their children on purpose in order to have them get chickenpox so that they would all develop, of course, their resistance to chickenpox. God knows how many, 1 in a million children that killed. I have no idea. And of course, chickenpox can be deadly, very rarely, etc. And it stays with you for life. It actually resides at the base of your spine, I believe, like a few other viruses, which don't come to mind right now. If we bring my father onto the show at some point, he can regale us with medical advice about that sort of stuff. But the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that unless you can demonstrably prove, that people are trying to spread the violence with intent to kill, you have no grounds. You just don't. You have no grounds. So now you're charging people with a regulatory offense, which was made by an order in council. It was not voted on, right? So this is an order in council. This was a public health order signed into law, not even into law, into the regulations that we must obey by, the minister, presented by the deputy minister, given to the minister, and signed into law. That is not a law. It's not. It certainly wasn't voted on by the legislature. People didn't get to weigh their vote on this. And it's just mind-boggling to me that we are now literally talking about garnishment. Do you know what garnishment means? Do you understand what blocking people to services is? Do you understand what that means? Like, this is like cutting people's utilities, right? Like, you do this when they don't pay their bills. You do this when someone fails to pay their cell phone bill. Suddenly their cell phone doesn't work anymore except on Wi-Fi. There are consequences to these things. These are contractual obligations, and we understand why they occur in all these other instances. But this is the equivalent. It is just below the equivalent of refusing to serve someone. Say that they had called 911 and they needed your help. To be someone in authority, to be a paramedic or to be a police officer or to be an emergency doctor or whatever, a fireman, and refuse to serve somebody based on, we're not quite at ethnicity, we're not quite at race, we're not quite at religion, but we're getting pretty damn close with saying that because you failed to mask, you are now going to get a fine from the government for failing to comply. So what that is a bill. It's a bill. And apparently now, on top of all the taxes I already pay, on top of all of the ways I must comply with the government in all other ways, I now have to pay a bill. So I have to mask or I have to pay a bill. Am I going to get fined for not getting vaccinated? This is insane. This is completely insane. And that will not stand. People are not going to stand for that. That's not going to happen. So again, I don't mean to make every episode about COVID, but it's just, she did send this to me and I did want to give that shout out, but also it's legitimately an insane point. I can't imagine doing that to someone. I can't imagine imposing that kind of policy on somebody. This is to put not masking and other trespasses against COVID up there with the same level as being a deadbeat dad or not paying your taxes. Like that doesn't make sense. You can't equivocate these things. This is a false equivalency. But we have fallen into this because we're here. We're here now. The idea that the government really could take your license away for having one beer with dinner because you've made the rates so low. The idea that they could come and test you hours after you've already gotten home and you may have had a couple in the backyard. We had that law come up from the liberals, the current federal liberals. This has gotten out of hand. It's gotten completely insane, and it needs to stop. It needs to stop. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again on the show. If everybody just got up tomorrow and started acting normally again and just pretending like 2019 never ended and just moved on with their lives, washed their hands, and maybe didn't cough directly on grandma, because you shouldn't be doing that anyways. Don't cough on grandma. That's not okay. Then we could just move on with life. And I don't understand why our own leadership is so married to this nonsense that they are literally holding us hostage. I don't get it. It makes no sense to me. And shame on all of you. It's not a joke. Shame on you. If you are in leadership and you are listening to this broadcast right now and you have an iota of sympathy or empathy for that idea of garnishing people's wages and fining people, you are the problem, and you should resign immediately and get the hell out of leadership, because you are not a leader. You are a coward. End of discussion. So we're going to close out the show on that extremely positive note. But if all things, right, in all things, charity, in all things, we hope and pray. And that is my hope and my prayer, especially as we come up to this Pentecost feast, as the Spirit comes down, that finally some common sense descends on the people who are supposedly in charge and get us out of this rather ridiculous situation. That was Mountain Standard Time. Tune in tomorrow. We have Grant Havers on to discuss what's happening in conservatism in Canada, particularly Alberta, as things fall apart for the Kenney government. And we're also going to be talking to Mr. Steidel, I believe his name is, of Stop the Spray, about a recent report that spraying after cutting down all the trees in British Columbia is a really bad idea that actually creates toxins in our environment. So we shouldn't do that. So that's going to be tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. Thank you so much for watching.